And I have to make an announcement. This talk is just a honeypot. You can all go now. Ah, they don't believe me, you see? Okay, who of you has a honeypot? 1, 2, 3. Can I have a little bit more lights on the audience, please, so I can see some? Thank you. A couple of you have honeypots running. And do you think they are secure? Do you think they can't be used against you? Think again. Dean Sisman and Itmar Scher will now present you how honeypots can be deceived and actually be used against you. A warm welcome, please.
Okay, hello everyone. Unfortunately for us, Gadi had to miss this talk, so we will make do without him, even though he's a very, he brings a lot of weight to every talk. If he was here, you would realize it's funny because he's fat, but never mind. Okay, so what essentially are we going to talk about? What we're going to do is show you how how a honeypot can be used for your advantage, but then how it's been used before and how we can improve on it and what disadvantages it brings when it's being used, right? Okay, so just a disclaimer, this is a technical talk. We're going to go into a lot of technical material, but as you will see, which is a surprising fact, there's very little knowledge required in order to circumvent a lot of the honeypots that's very popular today. So the technology here is going to be pretty basic and pretty fundamental. And this is about us. We all work together at Symmetria. All pretty, been doing this for many, many years, and this is a big part of our lives and part of the community, obviously. Right, so first of all, I'd just like to talk about what the hell is cyber deception. It's this weird buzzword that you would imagine like a lawyer using and not really understanding what it means. What we're talking about is we would like to be able to take the attacker's behavior and his methodology and be able to impact it. Because if we're able to impact that, we're able to gain detection, mitigation, prevention, a lot of very interesting stuff that deception gives us as soon as we're able to influence the attacker's decision-making process. Right, so a lot of people have been advancing this field a lot. Even a lot of German people. Fred Cohen's deception toolkit was the first thing that ever came out that talked about deception. Les Spitzner and the HoneyNet project have been doing very amazing work, and they've really advanced this field a lot over the last few decades. But what we will be talking about is how the perception of what honeypots can do for us today is very different than what people usually perceive that they do. So what's the difference between an attack and an attacker, right? An attack is a specific piece of technology that changes very dynamically and is very hard to capture. And that's what a lot of the intrusion detection tools nowadays are trying to figure out how to detect. And it's very difficult. Everybody knows about the false positive problem and everything. But the attackers usually have a very definitive method of how they work, right? There's the first beachhead, which gets through spear phishing. Then you do lateral movement in the network. You gain domain or admin credentials, and then you look for the intelligence you're looking for, right? And this is very hard to change or very hard to dynamically do differently. And this is sort of how the attacker feels like when he's inside your network, right? There's this fog of war where I've infiltrated a network, and now I want to get to the information I'm looking for, but I have no idea what's going on. And this is one of the only advantages the defenders have over an attacker, and that is that they know their network much, much better than the attacker does. So why not use that advantage for your own benefit, right? And if we look at this in a more strategic way, in the US Army, in the Air Force, they came up with this methodology called the OODA loop. And OODA means observe, orient, decide, and act. And this is like a strategic algorithm for tactical situations. And if you can influence the observation period, then obviously you're able to influence the entire behavior of the attacker, right? So what we basically want to do is this, right? Even though this is a bad metaphor because the Wile E. Coyote usually loses to the Roadrunner. But this is essentially what deception is and what honeypots have been trying to implement, right? So this could actually be a very big change if we're able to deceive attackers, right? Because deceiving an attacker might be something that's very economically cheap but very expensive for the attacker, which is something we don't have today. And when we're talking about what's the elements of doing cyber deception, it all comes down to something very basic, which is the decoy, which is this one unit of deception in a digital network, right? Okay, so one of the advantages of doing this is that when an attacker gets to a decoy and attacks it, by definition, nobody knows about this decoy. Nobody should be accessing it. Nobody should be talking to it. We know that whoever is talking to it on our network is an attacker or some sort of threat that's looking around and doing stuff he shouldn't be doing. And this gives you very clear-cut knowledge about what's going on in your network and who's trying to do stuff they shouldn't be doing, right? And specifically, if you get any new code execution being run on that decoy, you know for 100% that new code is an attack, right? Okay, so now we're going to go into some descriptions. The most popular honeypots out there are what people call low interaction honeypots. And we'll go into defining what that is pretty soon. But what they're very useful for is malware, known malware, automatic exploitation, botnet scanning, and all that sort of stuff. But they are very limited. And the reason for that is they do emulation of stuff on the network, right? They don't do the actual stuff. They just simulate it. And then when an attacker reaches it, there's a risk for the defender. And that risk is that if the defender doesn't deceive the attacker in 100%, if an attacker is aware of being deceived, he can use that against the defender, right? If you know where a honeypot is deployed in a network and you want to attack that network, what you'll be doing is just DDoSing that honeypot, because the alerts from that will take all the attention of the defender, and then you can go about it in whichever way you want, right? Okay, so what's the difference between low interaction and high interaction honeypots? So low interaction is, like we said, is just a simulation of some network protocol. High interaction honeypots are the actual machine themselves that the attacker can actually successfully attack, right? Because we want him to be able to do whatever he's doing and feel like it's a real machine. And now for like a little understanding in terminology, is being able to fingerprint a honeypot, is that a vulnerability? Well, it's an interesting question because, for example, Tor has a lot of code execution vulnerabilities. These are pretty obviously vulnerabilities, but in Tor, what we're actually interested in finding is the user's original IP, right? Because that's the objective of Tor. So for example, if you could find the specific IP of a Tor user, is that considered a vulnerability? Well, we feel it is, but terminology here is pretty gray area, right? Okay, so when we're talking about low interaction honeypots, those are just simulations of network services, right? Could be SMB, SMTP, DNS, all the popular stuff that hackers are looking for and wanting to exploit. It's pretty easy. Just basically what happens is people write some sort of script that implements the protocol's behavior and the way it answers queries and everything. And then we can see who's talking to us, and that way we can monitor what's an attacker and what's not. High interaction honeypots are the actual systems themselves. So for example, if I'm trying to show an SMTP server, what I'll be doing is actually have a real SMTP server running. And the difference is that this is much harder to monitor, right? For example, if you put a Windows machine and try to monitor all the SMB traffic to it on the network, it's insanity, right? Because the amount of noise is incredible. And then we again go back to the regular problem of false positives and how to differentiate noise from stuff that isn't noise. Okay, so when we started this thing, we tried and found out who else knows how to find honeypots in networks. And Shodan has this interesting website, which is called HoneyScore. And HoneyScore, you give it an IP, and then it tells you if it's a honeypot or not. And we started playing around with this, and we couldn't get it to say something is a honeypot, right? So we actually created online public-facing IPs with honeypots and gave it the IP, and it couldn't detect that it's a honeypot. So we tried and figure out what does it actually detect, and then we found out about something called conpot, right? So conpot is a SCADA-type honeypot. What it does is it looks like a SCADA machine, but it only implements a very small part of the protocol. And what happens, one of the Shodan guys did some research into how conpot works. And he found out that every conpot implementation out there has the same name, which is Mauser Factory, right? Which is not very deceiving. But then somebody figured out that that's the default, and people made it configurable, so you can change it to whatever you want. And then there was another guy online called Sean Merdiger who found out that they all have the same serial number, and this is also not configurable. So if you go on Shodan online and you put in this number, you find a bunch of honeypots deployed around the world which are conpot, right? And then when we tried and took one of those IPs into Shodan, we finally got it to recognize that it's a honeypot, right? So other people have been trying to attempt this because it gives a lot of value, but it doesn't really work for most of the honeypots out there. Okay. Okay, somebody in the audience asked me to talk slowly, so I'll try. Thank you. Okay, so what we will be doing is going through each project of what we will be doing is going through a lot of the popular honeypot projects, from the most simple implemented ones to the most complex ones, and show how each gives you another layer of deception, but how we use that layer and circumvent it or use it to our advantage, right? So we start with artillery. Artillery is a pretty cool project. What it does, it's very popular. You just run it on a system, and what happens is it opens up all the ports that are closed that look like something that's interesting to an attacker, right? So SMTP, DNS, HTTP, whatever. And whenever somebody is trying to access one of those ports, what happens is this, right? So it just gives you random information when you're trying to access one of the ports that artillery set up. And then it blocks you away. The way it blocks you is by putting in a rule in the IP tables for your IP, right? So the thinking is, I'm a defending in a network, right? And I want to do a honeypot on all my machines. I run artillery. And then if somebody's trying to exploit stuff against, I don't know, SMTP servers, they'll hit one of my machines, and then they'll get blocked because the IP tables rule blocks it, right? Obviously, this doesn't look very deceiving, right? If I'm an attacker in our network and I'm trying to talk to some sort of port, this doesn't look like SMTP. Like I said, what it does, it just gives you random data, no real deception being employed, but it blocks the IP that it sees, right? This is very dangerous. The reason for that is if that network doesn't have any protection against network spoofing, you can spoof any IP you want, and artillery will block it. The reason being is you can just send it 2 packets with the source IP changed, and it doesn't try and connect back to the original source and see if they're true, right? So just by sending 2 packets, you can make the machine that's running artillery block any IP you want, and this even works for the gateway, right? So you can just make it drop from the network completely and not have any network connectivity. Right, so what can we learn from artillery's work is that if there's a port and nobody should be touching it, and somebody is touching it, then that's an indicator of attacker activity. Right, so now let's switch our hats and think as attackers. Now that we know that artillery is out there, what do we do? So now we need to consider that every place we're connecting to might be a trap, and we need to check if it's actually real. right? Okay. And next we go to Bear Trap. So Bear Trap actually implements some of the services it's broadcasting and tries to make sense of it. The biggest one it's trying to